Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive back into Azure. This time, we're getting you prepped to ace the AZ-104 exam. And trust me, you're going to want to know this stuff because today we're talking about implement and manage storage.
Absolutely. This is a big one. It's a significant part of the exam, so understanding these concepts is essential to getting that certification.
So let's paint a picture for our listeners. Let's say you're an admin for a company moving all their data to Azure. You need to figure out how to store all kinds of data, VMs, backups, applications, everything. Where do you even start?
That's where a solid understanding of Azure storage comes in. It's a lot like building a house, right? You wouldn't use the same materials for the foundation as you would for the walls. Azure storage account types are kind of like that. Each one has its own strengths and ideal use cases.
So you're saying it's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You wouldn't store your award-winning chili recipe on a napkin, would you? You'd want to keep it somewhere safe, accessible, someplace where it wouldn't get lost.
Okay, I can definitely get behind a good chili metaphor. Let's talk about these storage account types. What are the big ones we need to know for the AZ-104?
All right, well, you've got your blob storage. Think of that as like your all-purpose storage unit in Azure, perfect for things like virtual machine disks, log files, even those massive media files.
Okay, I'm with you.
Then there's general purpose V1, GPV1 as it's usually called, and general purpose V2, so GPV2. Those are great when you've got a mix of structured and unstructured data, like databases or application data. And then, of course, there's premium storage. That one's designed for high-performance applications, the ones that need the absolute lowest latency and the highest throughput. We're talking things like SQL databases or websites that get a ton of traffic.
Okay, so blob storage is like our catch-all. GPV1 and GPV2 are the versatile middle ground, and premium is for when you absolutely need the best performance.
Gotcha. But how do you actually decide which one to use, in the real world? Because that's what the exam's going to ask about, right? You're absolutely right. The exam is all about application. They'll give you a scenario, and you have to choose the best storage account type. Like they might say, you need to store large video files that won't be accessed very often but need to be kept for years. What would you pick?
Large video files that don't get access much. Sounds like we want to save money, but still keep those files for a long time. So would blob storage be the best choice there?
Bingo. Blob storage is really cost-effective, especially for storing those large, infrequently accessed files. Plus, it gives you different access tiers like hot, cool, and archive, so you can really fine-tune your costs based on how often you need that data.
Ooh, access tiers. Those sound interesting. It's kind of like choosing the right temperature for your data.
That's a great way to think about it. Imagine your freezer, right? The stuff you use every day is front and center. Then you've got the leftovers you might eat next week. And then way in the back are those things you forgot you even had.
No comment on what's hiding in the back of my freezer, but I get your point.
Well, Azure storage tiers are similar. Hot access tier is for your frequently accessed data. Fastest retrieval, but it costs a bit more. Cool tier is for data you access less often, like maybe backups or archives. So it strikes a balance between cost and performance. And then you've got the archive tier, which is meant for long-term retention and compliance stuff you almost never touch. It's the cheapest, but it takes the longest to retrieve.
Okay, so it's like choosing between express delivery, standard shipping, and snail mail for your data. But what happens if I choose archive to save money, but then I need that data in a hurry?
That is a great question, and you can bet the exam might ask something like that too. You can move data between tiers, say from archive to hot. But there is a cost to retrieve it, and it might take a bit longer depending on how much data we're talking about. Picking the right tier from the start is definitely the way to go.
This whole conversation is making me hungry. We've got chili, freezers, snail mail. Can we go back to technology before I order takeout?
Right, back to storage. Besides storage account types and access tiers, another key concept is storage replication. Imagine this. Disaster strikes. We're talking a major natural disaster, and your primary Azure region goes completely offline. What happens to all your data?
Oh, man, that's like my worst nightmare. Makes you want to keep backups on a different planet.
Well, that's where Azure's replication options have you covered. We've got LRS, GRS, and ZRS. Each one gives you a different level of redundancy, different geographic coverage, all to make sure your data is safe, even if the worst happens.
Okay, break it down for me. What do those acronyms even stand for, and what's the difference?
Sure thing. Let's start with LRS, which stands for Locally Redundant Storage. Imagine you've got a server in an Azure data center and it crashes. With LRS, your data is replicated synchronously 3 times within that data center. So even if one server fails, your data is still safe.
So it's like having multiple backup copies within the same building, just in case one room has a problem. But what about those bigger disasters? That's where GRS comes in.
Exactly. GRS, or G-redundant storage, replicates your data to a secondary region hundreds of miles away. So even if your whole primary region goes down, like a natural disaster or a power outage, you have a full copy of your data ready to go in a different location.
Now that's reassuring, like having a backup generator for your whole data center. Okay, so what about ZRS? Is that like the ultimate safety net for data?
You could say that. ZRS, which stands for Zone Redundant Storage, replicates your data synchronously across multiple availability zones within the same Azure region. Think of availability zones as physically separate data centers within that region, each with its own power, cooling, and network setup.
So even if a whole availability zone goes down, your data is safe in another one within the same region. That's pretty impressive. But with all these options, how do we choose the right one for the AZ-104 exam? They're not going to just ask us to define each one right.
You're right. It's all about applying what you know. They might give you a situation, like an application that needs high availability within a specific region, and then ask you to choose the most cost-effective replication type. Like if they're emphasizing low latency and keeping data within a specific region, then ZRS would be the way to go.
Makes sense. It's not just about memorizing acronyms, it's about knowing when to use each replication strategy. This is another area where hands-on experience in Azure can really help, don't you think?
Absolutely. There's no substitute for getting your hands dirty in the Azure portal, setting up different storage accounts, trying out the replication options. That's how it all really comes together.
Totally agree. Now, before we move on to our next storage adventure, any other exam tips for our listeners about storage accounts, tiers, or replication?
One thing to remember is that Microsoft loves to ask about cost optimization. So be ready for questions that ask you to compare different storage options and pick the most cost-effective solution for a given situation.
Great point. Knowing the tech stuff is important, but you got to be mindful of the budget too.
Absolutely. In the real world, budget matters just as much as technical needs.
Okay, listeners, remember, cost optimization is key. Now, you ready to move on to Azure Files? It's kind of like network drives, but in the cloud.
Let's do it. Azure Files is a service that doesn't always get the spotlight, but it can be super useful.
Sounds good. But first, a word from our sponsors. Just kidding. We'll be right back after this imaginary commercial break. All right, we are back and ready to tackle Azure Files. It's funny, Azure Files is one of those Azure services that I don't think gets enough attention, but it can be, honestly, a lifesaver in certain situations.
Oh, absolutely. Remember we were just talking about those old school network drives? That's exactly what Azure Files brings to the cloud. You can create these fully managed file shares that you can access from anywhere.
Okay, so help me wrap my head around this.
Right.
Let's say I'm working on a project and my team is, spread out all over the place. We need one central spot to store and share files, but nobody wants to deal with, clunky VPNs or emailing these huge files back and forth. Is that where Azure Files comes in?
You got it. You create a file share in the cloud with Azure Files, and then you can just mount it on your computer, just like a local drive. It doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Linux, Mac OS. It just works.
So it's like having this magic folder that syncs across everyone's computers, even if they're miles apart.
Exactly. And here's the best part. You don't have to worry about any of the infrastructure or hardware failures or OS updates because Azure handles all of that for you.
That is a huge plus, especially for IT teams that are already stretched thin. But gotta ask, what about security? We're talking about important company data here. So how do we make sure that only the people who are supposed to have access to these Azure file shares actually do?
Absolutely, and that's a critical question. Thankfully, Microsoft takes security very seriously. With Azure Files, you've got options. You can use Enter ID for authentication, so only users with valid credentials can get in. Plus, you can set up network security groups, to restrict access by IP address or even specific virtual networks within Azure.
So we're putting a digital lock on our file share. We decide who gets a key.
Exactly. And if you want to grant temporary access, maybe just to certain files or folders, you can even use those shared access signatures, those SAS things we talked about.
Oh, right, the temporary access passes. So I could give a contractor access to a specific folder for a limited time without giving them access to, the whole shebang.
Exactly. And here's a little exam tip. Microsoft might throw a question your way about the different service tiers available for Azure Files.
Ooh, right. Just like with blob storage. We've got choices to make.
You got it. You've got premium, transaction optimized, hot and cool tiers. Each one has different performance levels, different throughput, different costs, the whole deal.
So again, it's all about choosing the right tool for the job based on what you need and what your budget looks like. Like if I've got an application that's constantly accessing files and needs super fast response times, premium tier is probably the way to go, right?
You nailed it. Premium is specifically designed for those performance-heavy workloads. But if you're mainly dealing with backups or archives that don't need to be accessed all the time, the hot or cool tiers might make more sense for your budget.
This takes me back to our chili analogy. If you're having a chili cook-off and you need that secret recipe right away, you want it up front in the freezer, easy to grab. But if it's just a backup copy, it can chill in the back with the frozen veggies.
I love the way you think. Now, ready for another real-world scenario that might pop up on the AZ-104?
Get me with it. I'm feeling ready to take on any Azure Files challenge you've got.
Okay, so let's say you're working with a company that's got this, well, legacy application, and it relies on network file shares, like a lot. They want to move everything to Azure, but they need a way to move those file shares to the cloud without, causing a major disruption for users. What would you recommend?
So it sounds like Azure Files is the answer, but there's got to be a way to migrate those existing file shares without causing any downtime or major headaches. Is there like a specific tool or service that can help us out here?
And that, my friend, is where Azure File Sync comes in.
Azure File Sync. Okay, tell me more because this sounds promising.
So picture this. Azure File Sync lets you take all those company file shares and put them in Azure Files, but you keep all the flexibility, the performance, the compatibility of an on-premises file server.
Wait, so you're saying I can have my files in the cloud and on my local server at the same time? How does that even work?
It's a bit like magic, but with a lot less glitter and a lot more, ones and zeros. Basically, Azure File Sync creates this mirror image of your on-premises file share in an Azure file share. It's a two-way sync, keeping everything in sync.
So any changes on my end get synced to the cloud, and anything in the cloud gets synced back down to me.
You got it. And the best part, users, they don't even realize anything's changed. They keep accessing files from the same place they always have, even though those files are actually living in Azure.
That is so smart. It's like sneaking healthy stuff into a recipe. They get the same taste and experience they're used to, but behind the scenes, it's all powered by the cloud.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. What if we're talking about a massive amount of data? Like, won't that take forever to sync?
No, that is an excellent question. And it brings us to another important tool in the Azure storage world, and that is Azure Data Box. If you're dealing with like terabytes or even petabytes of data, transferring all of that over the network, well, let's just say it might not be the most efficient way to go about it. Okay, so what do? Do we load up a bunch of hard drives and ship them to the nearest Azure data center?
You're on the right track, but we're a little more high-tech than that. With Azure Data Box, Microsoft sends you this physical appliance. Think of it like a super rugged hard drive on steroids that you load up with all your data, then you ship it back to Azure, and they handle getting all that data into your Azure storage accounts.
Wow, so it's like a high-speed, secure data shuttle service. I like it. Okay, so Azure File Sync for your day-to-day syncing needs and Data Box when you've got massive data to move.
You got it. Now, before we wrap up Azure Files, we've got to talk about security.
Yes, because security should never be an afterthought, especially when we're dealing with sensitive data in the cloud.
100%. And Azure has a whole bunch of tools and features to help keep your Azure Files deployments safe and sound. We already talked about a few, like Entra ID integration and network security groups.
Right, those are great for controlling who can even get to the file shares and from where. But what about protecting the actual data itself?
Azure's got you covered. First of all the data stored in Azure Files, it's encrypted at rest using Microsoft Managed Keys. So even if someone got unauthorized access to the storage hardware, they still couldn't read the data.
Okay, so that's reassuring. Like it's in a vault, even when it's just sitting there in the cloud. But what about when the data is moving between my computer and the Azure file share?
Another great question. Azure enforces HTTPS by default for all communication with Azure Files, so your data is always encrypted in transit using strong encryption like TLS or SSL.
So we've got encryption at rest, encryption in transit. What else can we do to make it even more secure?
One really powerful feature is Azure Storage Service Encryption, or SSE, and that adds another layer of encryption at the storage level. And with SSE, you've got choices. You can use Microsoft Managed Keys, customer managed keys, or even your own keys stored in Azure Key Vault.
Okay, hold on. I'm getting a little lost in the key section here.
Yeah.
Can you break down that last one for me?
Of course. With customer managed keys, you are the key master. You have total control over the keys used to protect your data. You generate them, you store them, you manage them all in Azure Key Vault, which is like a super secure, hardware-backed service for managing keys and secrets.
That's like having your own Fort Knox for your encryption keys.
Exactly. And that's something that might pop up on the AZ-104. They want to know that you understand these encryption options and when you might choose one over another.
This is all great info, so listeners, take notes. Okay, before we move on, let's see if I can stump you with a real-world storage situation.
Oh, I love a good challenge. Bring it on.
All right, let's say you're working for this research institution, and they need to store massive amounts of genomic data. I'm talking petabytes of data. They don't access this data very often, but they have to keep it for compliance and potential future research. Money's tight, but they absolutely have to make sure this data is secure and won't disappear. What Azure storage solution would you suggest, keeping in mind that they need something cost-effective for long-term data storage?
Great question. This is a perfect example of how important it is to think about all the factors, right? Cost, accessibility, security, and how long you need to keep the data when you're designing an Azure storage solution. In this case, with all that data, infrequent access, and the budget being a major factor, I'd recommend using a combo of Azure Blob Storage with the Archive Access tier and a solid data lifecycle management strategy.
Okay, now you've got me really interested. Tell me more.
So Azure Blob Storage is perfect for storing huge amounts of unstructured data, like that genomic data. And the Archive Access tier is the most affordable option when you don't need to access data frequently.
Right, it's like the deep freeze for data. Out of sight, out of mind, but still there if you need it, and it won't cost a fortune. But how do we make sure that data stays safe and accessible over the long haul?
That's where data lifecycle management comes in. We can set up policies to automatically move data between those different access tiers based on how it's being used. So if some of that genomic data suddenly becomes super important for a new research project, we can move it to the hot or cool tier for faster access.
So you're saying we're not locked into one tier forever. We can be flexible and adjust as needed.
Exactly. And to make sure the data is safe from, any unfortunate events and doesn't get lost, we can use Azure's built-in redundancy features like geo-redundant storage, which basically creates copies of the data in different Azure regions.
This is making so much sense. So we use the right storage service, the right access tier, a smart data management strategy, and boom, we've got a solution that can handle even the most demanding storage scenarios.
You got it. That's what I love about Azure Storage, honestly. It's so flexible. You've got so many options. You can really create the perfect solution for any situation.
This has been awesome. We've covered so much about Azure storage today.
We have different storage account types, access tiers, replication options, security features, data management, even compliance. We even went deep on Azure files, migrating files to the cloud, IPA compliance, massive data sets, all sorts of good stuff.
And we managed to do it without getting lost in the technical weeds or losing sight of the bigger picture.
That was the goal. We want to make sure you've got the knowledge and the confidence not just to pass the AZ-104 exam, but to really use Azure Storage effectively in real-life situations.
Speaking of real-life situations, it's time to put all that knowledge to the test. You ready for another potential exam question?
Hit me with it. I'm ready for anything.
All right, here we go. Imagine this. You're an Azure administrator. You're working with a company that deals with sensitive medical records. They need to store these records securely in the cloud, and of course they have to comply with HAPO regulations. What Azure storage service and features would you recommend to make sure they check all those boxes? This one's a thinker.
Ooh, you're not kidding. This scenario, you've got to nail both security and compliance. Let me see. To make sure everything's HIPAA compliant, ooh, you're not kidding. This scenario, you've got to nail both security and compliance. Let me see. To make sure everything's HIPAA compliant, we'd need a service with really strong encryption, audit logging, and tight access control. I think Azure Blob Storage would be a good fit for storing these medical records.
Azure Blob Storage, okay. But we've got to make it HIPAA compliant. What can we do to lock that down?
First things first, we enable Azure Storage Service Encryption, or SSE, and we'll use customer-managed keys that are stored in Azure Key Vault. That way the company has full control over those encryption keys and they can meet those strict HIPAA requirements for data protection.
So it's like those medical records are locked up tight and only the company has the key. Sounds pretty secure.
Exactly. And to boost security even more, plus meet those auditing requirements, we'd enable Azure Storage Logs. That way, every time someone tries to access or change data in the storage account, it's logged, creating an audit trail so we can check for compliance.
So if someone tries to sneak a peek at those records, we'll know about it. No unauthorized access allowed.
You got it. And then, to make sure only the right people have access, we use Entra ID for role-based access control. RBAC. We can set up specific roles and permissions, making sure that only authorized individuals can get to those sensitive medical records.
Okay, so we've got encryption, audit logs, and super tight access control, all working to protect those medical records and keep them HIPAA compliant. Sounds like we've built a pretty solid case here.
You know it. And remember, on the AZ-104 exam, Microsoft might throw a similar scenario at you and ask you to pick the best storage service and security features to meet specific compliance requirements.
Good point. Listeners, pay attention to those compliance requirements. They can make or break your Azure storage solution. Okay, before we wrap up this storage deep dive, are there any other important Azure storage services or features we should touch on for the exam?
One more service that often pops up on the exam is Azure Queue Storage. It's not a permanent storage solution like Blob or Files, but it's really important for building applications on Azure that can scale and handle a lot of requests.
Azure Queue Storage. Okay, that rings a bell, but refresh my memory. What's that one all about?
Imagine you've got an application that has to deal with tons of requests all the time, like an e-commerce site processing orders or like a social media platform dealing with all those image uploads.
Lots of users, lots of activity, data flying everywhere. I get it.
Right. And you don't want your application to get bogged down trying to process all of that in real time. That's where queues come in. They act like a waiting room for messages or tasks that need to be handled, but not right this second. They can be processed, asynchronously.
So like a digital holding area for data.
Exactly. Let's say a request comes in, and your application can put a message in the queue. This message can contain all the info about what needs to happen, like processing an order or resizing an image, whatever it needs to be. And then other parts of your application, sometimes called workers or background tasks, they pull those messages from the queue and process them at their own pace.
Ah, so instead of everything trying to cram through the door at once, we've got a system to line things up and deal with them in a much more efficient way. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And that's what Azure Queue Storage does. It's a really scalable and reliable way to store and retrieve messages so your application can handle those busy periods, those traffic spikes, without breaking a sweat.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. How does this tie back to the AZ-104 exam?
They might ask you about when you'd use Azure Queue Storage and how it's different from other storage services. Like, they might give you a scenario and ask you to choose the right storage option. If it involves asynchronous processing, handling loads of requests, or decoupling different parts of an app, Azure Queue Storage is going to be a good bet.
Okay, so it's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about knowing how it all works in the real world. Got it.
Exactly.
This has been an awesome deep dive into Azure storage. We covered so much today.
We really did. We talked about different storage account types, access tiers, how to keep your data safe with replication, all the important security features, data management, even how to make sure everything's compliant. We explored Azure Files, learned how to move on-premise files to the cloud with Azure File Sync, even tackled some real-world scenarios with high-pay compliance and working with huge data sets.
We definitely covered a lot. But remember, practice makes perfect. Don't just listen to us and call it a day.
Please don't. Go out there, fire up that Azure free trial, play around with the different storage services, and most importantly, have some fun with it. Because learning is a lot easier, and the knowledge sticks with you when you actually enjoy it.
So true. And who knows, maybe you'll discover a passion for cloud storage along the way. It's more exciting than you might think.
It really is.
Until next time, everyone, happy Azuring.